I'm here at the studios of KALW with Darris Young, a community organizer with the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights and a substance abuse, domestic violence, and youth violence prevention counselor. Darris spent 17 years in prison, and we just finished a show about reform and rehabilitation. We're doing a week-long series about the $80 billion U.S. prison system. And Darris, can you talk a little bit about what reform actually means to you? Because it's getting so much attention in the national media. You've got all these politicians talking about reform, but what does that actually look like? What does that mean to you?
Well, what reform looks like to me is, first of all, reforming how people are treated behind the walls while they're incarcerated. And that's opening up more programs and services that will prepare them to walk out of the door to reentry, which is the second component. So it means investing more in people while they're in prison and then making a substantial investment once they're outside of prison. And that comes in making sure that a person, man or female, can return back to their communities and actually find a place to live. And I don't think that, that's been a part of this national conversation, because I look at nationally, we have run into the same problem when it comes to areas that weren't once, inhibited by or habitated by men and women that were in prison. They're returning to their communities now, unable to live where they came from. So because of the gentrification and how the prices of housing has gone up. So unless a person has a stable environment to return to, then he or she is less likely, if they do get a job, to secure that, to keep that job for very long, because there's no stability. So reform has to be spent in dollars and cents that prepares a person inside of prison so they can get the necessary skills needed to come outside of prison or jail and then continue in those services. And that means having more housing, more employment, and a better connection to mental health services.
What I also find interesting is a lot of people are spending time talking about the fact that you now have conservatives and Republicans talking about prison reform, yet these are the very same people who want to cut the very important programs that are needed both inside prison and outside of prison. And this has come up during this week, but I haven't really heard this angle really discussed much in the national conversation.
Well, I've given it a lot of thought, and I think about it in terms of what Michelle Alexander pointed out in her book that actually started this conversation. Was the new Jim Crow, mass incarceration in the age of colorblindness. And I think that, if you can say the same thing in regards to the issue of what we're going to do with the slaves when we let them out of slavery. They had people from both sides of the aisle that came together on this. And I think we have to be very skeptical about this, because right now it's very chic to talk about it, right? Because we know that people who lost money during the recession and their pensions and things like that, a lot of them blamed it on, the state spending on over incarceration. So I think that, in coming together across the aisle, there are some people that actually are genuine about, actually reducing the amounts of money that are spent on incarceration and putting it back into programs. But others are just in it to maybe find a new way to make their thing work. And so I think we have to be very cautious about it. And if they're really serious about prison reform, then they have to get serious about the economic and poverty situation, because unless you attack poverty, which Martin Luther King actually talked about in his latter years, at least if we don't do that, then 20 years from now we'll be in the same boat that we are in today. So that is, unless that's a point of the conversation, we're not going to go anywhere.
Right, and that has come up during this week-long series on prisons and the many, many shows that we've done on race and police. The fact that we really need to address poverty in order to truly tackle these issues.
Yeah.
And then I also wanted to talk to you about the human element of this, because it's almost like there are these numbers behind bars, and we need to get rid of some of them. And we don't really talk about the human side of prison and how prison actually affects people. We did a show yesterday about the youth that are behind bars, the youth in solitary confinement, just about how prison affects people and how hard it is to transition. What do you think, as someone who spent 17 years in prison, what do you want people to know about the human side of this?
Well, I think that from the human side, especially when we talk about the juvenile justice system, right? And I believe it was years ago, and I can't remember the name of this movie, but it was about this guy who actually started this program for boys back. He was called Boys Town, and he had this slogan that there's no such thing as a bad boy, and I would go further. There's no such thing as a bad child. Children are in developmental stages of their lives, and so we develop. And unfortunately, in the last 40 or 30 years, we haven't had structures that help develop our children like there were maybe 40, 50 years ago, because so much money was divested from communities to be able to do that. Parks and Recreation is closed down. We start spending more on prison guards than recreational leaders and stuff like that. So that caused a shift in the change. And so one thing from the human side is that people suffer when they're in prison. And I don't think that, you can't say, we're not sent to prison to be punished. You were sent to prison as a punishment. But when you start incorporating prison as to be punished, then I think you lose the perspective of the humanness. And if you don't connect to the human side of a man or a woman, investing in their human side, then, people aren't going to come out of prison any better. Matter of fact, people come out worse because of the isolation, and those that have gone in because of mental health issues, they only exacerbate those issues and then make it worse upon release. So I think that, that's one of the things that we don't think about. Those one of the things that we don't talk about. Our juvenile justice system has to be more about treatment than incarceration. And when you start to do that, then you started to looking forward to building more healthier communities, because as one of your guests pointed out yesterday, he was a product of that system, but look what he's doing now.
Right.
And I think that that's not focused on enough. There ought to be like this big show on one of these big news stations on the number of men and women that have come out of prison and that are doing great things right now in the community. And because we always focus on the one person that does wrong. Well, let's do a show one day on the amount of men and women that have come out of prison that have changed their lives and are doing great things within the community. Let's do that. And I think some of the attitudes around people that are going to prison, that will change.
Yeah, that is a great idea, and they are not hard to find.
Yes.
And just quickly, if you could do two things to change this system, what would they be? What's at the top of your list?
Well, the first thing that I would do to change this system is, one, invest in young people while they're younger. While they're young. We need to invest in more restorative justice programs. We have to attack the school to prison pipeline and disparities for that. That's the first thing I would do. And then the second thing that I would do is I would call on our faith-based leaders who want to be a part of this conversation, but has literally, sat on the sidelines and allowed things to happen, to get more involved, and not just opening up their doors to people who believe in what they believe in, but open up their doors into the community that needs help. Allow community to use their space, because they occupy much of the space within impoverished communities, but yet so many doors are closed to the community and to the public. So I think those are the two things that I would do, and I think those things will make a great impact upon the communities that have been the feeders for the prison pipeline. Yes.
Darris Young is a community organizer with the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. He spent 17 years in prison, and he was on today's Your Call talking about real prison reform and rehabilitation. And you can find that show and the others that we did about prisons at yourcallradio.org. Darris, thank you again for coming in.
Thank you, and I appreciate you having me on.
Thank you.
Thank you.